Hello everyone. Today I'm going to take you back to December of 1860, to one of the most critical political moments in American history, President James Buchanan's final State of the Union address. Now, James Buchanan is remembered by most historians as the weakest president in U.S. history. His presidency ended just as the nation was on the verge of collapsing into the Civil War. And ironically, while most of his time in office was insignificant, his last speech, his State of the Union, was enormously significant. It came only 17 days before South Carolina officially seceded from the Union. And for me, this was fascinating to study because while I love history, I had never really examined Buchanan's rhetoric or his leadership role. And going into this, my prior assumption was simple. Buchanan was weak and his indecisiveness doomed his country. But reading the speech closely actually complicated that view because it showed me how his rhetoric was both deliberate and contradictory at the same time, and how the audience at that time might have heard it in a very different manner than I've read it today. So let's start with the basics, the rhetorical question. Who is Buchanan speaking to and why? The immediate audience was Congress. He opens formally with the line, "Fellow citizens of the Senate and House of Representatives." By design, the State of the Union is directed to lawmakers, but Buchanan also stretches to a secondary audience, the literate American public, who would read his address in newspapers. And for them, he says, how easy would it be for the American people to settle the slavery question forever and restore peace and harmony to this distracted country? He's clearly trying to pull in not just politicians, but the broader public who might influence the crisis. And there's a third audience worth pointing out as well. Southern leaders, especially those debating whether or not to secede, because he tries to appeal to their fears with imagery like, many a matron throughout the South retires at night in dread of what may befall herself and children before the morning. In other words, he paints a picture of enslaved people inspired toward rebellion by Northern agitation, and he plays on Southern fears of violence at home. So, Buchanan is speaking to Congress, to the American people, and especially to Southerners who are considering secession. That is a very wide audience, and it forces him into a delicate balancing act. The exigence, the reason for the speech, is urgent. The Union is unraveling. Abraham Lincoln had just been elected, and Buchanan's home state of Pennsylvania is watching closely as Southern states threaten secession. He blames the North for creating what he calls vague notions of freedom among enslaved people, and he says that this has destroyed the South's sense of security. He warns that if this fear spreads, then disunion will become inevitable. And this is where Buchanan tries to step in as the mediator. His purpose is to calm fears, to defend the Constitution, and to discourage secession. But the way he goes about it creates much bigger problems. Let's talk about the constraints that Buchanan faced. What made this so difficult for him? Well, first, his credibility was already shot. He was known as a doughface, a Northerner who sympathized with the South, and that meant Northerners saw him as a traitor, and the Southerners didn't fully trust him either. Second, he was a lame duck president. Lincoln had already been elected, and Buchanan had no political capital left, rather. His words carried little authority. And third, his strict interpretation of the Constitution prevented him from taking a really firm stance. He argues that secession is unconstitutional, yes, but at the same time he insists the federal government has no constitutional power to stop that. And that contradiction basically leaves him paralyzed. Finally, his tone is extremely lawyerly. He avoids passionate appeals, sounding more like he's drafting a legal brief than rallying a divided nation. This contradiction, this paradox, is the most striking thing about his address. On one hand, Buchanan says secession is unconstitutional, but on the other, he says coercion is also unconstitutional. What is he trying to say? Listen to this line. Has the Constitution delegated to Congress the power to coerce a state into submission? After much serious reflection, I've arrived at the conclusion that no such power has been delegated. So, the Union cannot be legally broken, but it also cannot be legally defended. That paradox leaves no solution, just a deadlock, and it reinforces why Buchanan is seen as indecisive and ineffective. Now, let's look at some of the rhetorical strategies he uses to try to paper over his contradiction. Well, first, he uses religious imagery. He personifies the Union as the greatest temple ever dedicated to human freedom. And that sounds inspiring, almost sacred, but when you put it next to his refusal to defend that temple, the image rings very hollow. Second, he quotes the Bible. Specifically, he uses Matthew 6:34, "Sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof." He's essentially saying, let's not act until evil actually happens. In hindsight, this was disastrous advice because disunion was already happening. And third, he appeals to international reputation. He argues that in every foreign region of the globe, the title of American citizen is held in the highest respect. He warns that secession would make America a global embarrassment. But for a nation teetering on civil war, that feels almost irrelevant. Why does that matter? And fourth, he leans heavily on legal precedent. He treats the Dred Scott decision of 1857 and the fugitive slave law as settled law, saying they confirm the right of Southerners to own slaves and retrieve fugitives. And for a modern reader, it's shocking that his proposed compromise was actually to add a constitutional amendment protecting slavery forever. But for his 1860 audience, this was just his attempt at conciliation. This is where positionality matters. Because as a modern reader, I find Buchanan's indecisiveness infuriating. Knowing that civil war was about to break out, his call to wait and see feels cowardly. But for Southerners in 1860, his refusal to use federal force may have felt reassuring, because it suggested they could secede without being attacked. But for foreign abolitionists, it read as weakness and betrayal. And for the general public, it probably sounded overly cautious, like a president more worried about legality than leadership. And in my own position, someone who knows the Civil War erupted just weeks later, this makes me desperate for him to take a stand. But in his time, constitutional literalism and compromise were highly valued. So to many, his tone may have sounded reasonable, even statesmanlike. But that's the gap between us and his original audience. And that's what makes this so significant. So here's my takeaway. Buchanan's 1860 State of the Union is a masterclass in contradiction. He acknowledges secession is unconstitutional, yet denies the government's power to stop it. His lawyerly phrasing, paradoxical stance, and weak appeal left him unable to repair the split of the Union at its breaking point. So for me, this speech shows how sometimes not taking a stand is itself a powerful rhetorical choice with huge consequences. It also shows how rhetoric lands differently depending on who is listening. For us, Buchanan reads as indecisive, but for the Southerners, he may have sounded protective. For Northerners, he sounded like a coward, and that gap in audience reception is crucial to understanding how rhetoric actually works across time. So, in closing, Buchanan's last speech reminds us that in politics, words alone aren't enough. Rhetoric that tries to appease everyone often satisfies nobody, and sometimes failing to act, to even take a firm stand, is the most consequential act of all.